Okay, good morning. So yesterday we learned the Gemara that discussed this unique practice of reciting the Kiddush in shul and synagogue on Friday night. And the way the Gemara phrased it was, those who have the custom to make Kiddush in shul Friday night, meaning the Gemara is phrasing it as such, there was already a custom that existed by the time the Gemara is having the discussion, which is the first generation of the Amoraic era, second generation, Rav and Shmuel. So the second generation post-Mishnaic era, which means they're describing a custom that already existed. And it's established practice. This is relevant, as we'll see. And then the Gemara discusses what are the consequences of that Kiddush. So everyone agrees, Rav and Shmuel, that the bracha you make hagafen, the blessing you make over the wine, right? There's two brachas you make in Kiddush, one over wine, one over Shabbos, excluding the first introductory paragraph, Yom Mashishi, which is lifted from the parsha in Bereshis describing creation, describing the first Shabbos. So there's two brachas. There's hagafen, and there's the bracha on Kiddush. So everybody agrees, as for hagafen, because you make hagafen in shul, and then you're going home to a new location to eat your meal, and if you want to have wine then, you'd have to make hagafen again, because the bracha you made hagafen in shul doesn't transfer to when you get home, and that's a question of the laws of blessings over food, which is not the subject of our discussion. Our discussion is focused on Kiddush, because we're spin-off of Kiddush on Pesach night. But that's a separate discussion as for the fact that when a person changes location, a new bracha is required, but that's here as well. You're making Kiddush in shul, the hagafen doesn't carry home. What about the Kiddush? The Kiddush is to make a blessing over the mitzvah of Shabbos. And as we're going to learn later in the Gemara, it's not just like any other bracha of mitzvahs, which every time we do a mitzvah, we thank Hashem for the mitzvah. So too is Shabbos. But moreover, there's even scriptural implication. The pasuk says, Zachar Sheva Shabbos, remember Shabbos. Zachar, which means to remember, also means to make mention. Like Zachar Asher Asalacha Amalek, remember that which Amalek did, also means to mention Amalek, which is what we do every day. Right? So you have to mention the Shabbos. That's what we do in our Kiddush. We declare Shabbos holy. Yeah.
One is good and the other is bad.
Fine. But the Torah says to remember them. There's six things.
We're supposed to erase them from our mind.
Okay, that's a good question. What does it mean to erase them? And while at the same time, you're also supposed to remember them. Good question. We'll leave that alone. But we every day we read in the backup at the end of davening the six remembrances, right? Because the word remember also means to mention in Hebrew. Zachar means to make mention and also to remember. Okay, so we make that mention, that declaration of Kiddush. Now, if you made Kiddush in shul, or if you heard Amen to someone who made Kiddush in shul, you've already fulfilled the obligation to make that bracha. So do you make that Kiddush again at home? And that was a dispute in the Gemara. Sorry? Irrespective of wine. Do I have an obligation to make the bracha on Kiddush again? Right? Wine and Kiddush are only two different brachas that we attach together. Right. We'll learn the Gemara later why we attach them together. But they're two different because they're two different brachas. One is the bracha over drinking wine, and one is the bracha over Shabbos. So the bracha over wine, if you want to drink wine at home, you got to make a new bracha. Okay, we're putting that aside. What about Kiddush? If I fulfilled my obligation to declare, to make the Kiddush in shul, either because I was the chazan and I made Kiddush in shul, or because I heard and I said Amen, am I now obligated to make Kiddush again at home? That was a dispute we had yesterday in the Gemara. One opinion is, well, the reason why we made Kiddush in shul is for anyone who doesn't have any family at home. This is the way Tosfos understood it, based on Rav. Anyone who doesn't have family at home, he can listen to Kiddush and fulfill his obligation, no problem, in shul, and then go home and have his meal, nekhala, have his meal. If you have a family at home, well, maybe you fulfilled your obligation for Kiddush when you were in shul and said Amen, but you got to go home and make Kiddush again for your family. What do we derive from there? We derive two things. Number one, in this view, you don't need to make Kiddush in the place where you're eating, because you can hear Kiddush in shul and then go home and eat. That's this view. Point number two we derive from this opinion is that even though you fulfilled your obligation in shul, you can still make a bracha again for someone else, for your family, wife and children. Now, of these two items, as we're going to learn, only the second item is halachic. The halacha remains, as we're going to learn later, that you have to make Kiddush in the place where you eat. But we also agree that if you fulfilled your obligation to make Kiddush, you can still make Kiddush again just for the sake of someone else. We're going to learn about that shortly. That's one view. The other view, Shmuel said, the reason why we're making Kiddush in Shul is for guests who are eating their meal in Shul. And because they're eating their meal in Shul, we save them the cost of a glass of wine by making Kiddush for them in Shul. But everyone else did not fulfill their obligation by hearing Kiddush in Shul, and they must make Kiddush at home even if they have no family, because one is obligated to make Kiddush in the place where they eat. And that's the halacha. Okay, so this last part, making Kiddush in the place where you eat, that's going to become the subject of the Gemara going forward, and then we're going to learn that in the Shulchan Aruch in Reish Ayin Gimel, chapter 273. Today we're looking at chapter 269 in the Shulchan Aruch, where the Alter Rebbe describes the halacha and the custom of making Kiddush in Shul. But I just gave you the Gemara's background, at least in brief, which is what we learned yesterday. We're clear so far? Okay, so let's learn the Shulchan Aruch. It'll become even more clear as we learn.
There must be something also about what happens between you leaving Shul and getting to your place, no?
Why?
Like maybe if I go home directly, then I guess it could transfer over. But what if
The
I
Kiddush.
stop? What if I...
It's a good question. So when we get to the laws of making Kiddush in the place where you eat, we're going to discuss that, as to how far away you have to be from your eating place for it to count that you're making Kiddush in the place of where you're going to have your meal.
Okay.
Like it's in the same room, it is in the same house, upstairs, downstairs, one room to the next room. We're going to discuss all that in the Gemara later. And that's all going to be discussed. But here we're talking about specifically the laws of making Kiddush in Shul.
Didn't we learn that if, let's say you drink a glass of wine here,
Mhm.
or anything, then you go into the kitchen over here, you've got to make it again.
Okay, so again,
So
now you're not talking about Kiddush now. You're talking about the laws of enjoying food. That's the bracha hagafen. So I established, you're right, that when you move location for hagafen, it's making hagafen. That's not the same thing as Kiddush though. Right? So again, the notion that the bracha hagafen doesn't transfer till you get home is correct, but we're shelving that because it's not our discussion. Here we're focusing on the other bracha, which is the Kiddush bracha. Right? So for example, if you're wearing, I don't know, for example, for a mitzvah which you do in two locations.
So we don't
Sorry?
we don't show anything.
Our custom is not, but we're going to learn that there are those who do. Friday night. Well, a lulav, yeah, once you did a mitzvah of lulav, for example.
Well, maybe the candles, lighting the candles for Shabbat.
Then I'm trying to think of a mitzvah which we have like, there's nothing like this. I don't think there's anything like that. Maybe tefillin, you're wearing tefillin in one room, you walk to the next room, you don't make another bracha just because you walked into a different room. Same thing with Shabbos. You made a bracha on Shabbos already, so you walked into a different room, you're making bracha on Shabbos again. You made your bracha on Shabbos already. Why are you making a bracha again? It's like wearing a pair of tefillin and walking to a different room. You don't make another bracha on your tefillin now.
What about a woman who lights the candles? Let's say if we light the candles at my house and then we're invited at my parents'
Okay,
house.
it's a different discussion. The bracha on candles is not a bracha on Shabbos. It's a bracha on candles. And that's a different discussion because the candles also should be in the place where you eat. So what do you do about that? Okay, I once did a class on that. I think I wrote about it once. It's a different discussion, which we're going to leave for now. Okay, so let's zero in on maybe if we have time after, we'll just talk about that briefly. Okay, let's look at the halachas. I'm going to read in the Hebrew, but you can follow in the English, and we might look at some footnotes. Okay, Aleph, Chacham Rishonim, the earliest sages. Tiknu established the Kaddish al Yayin to make Kiddush on wine, the basic necess in the synagogue in Shul. Right, as I mentioned, the Gemara's conversation about this practice is in the second generation of the Gemara, which is quite early. And the Gemara describes it as a custom that already was. Those who make Kiddush in Shul, here's the law. As if to say the custom predates the discussion in the Gemara, so it's really the early stages. How far back, we don't know, but sometime before the beginning of the Gemara's era.
So there's no Mishnah text on it?
No.
Which is interesting.
It predates the Gemara. It predates the second generation of the Gemara, but it's not mentioned in the Mishnah, at least not so far as it's come up yet. Which is why, presumably, the Alter Rebbe doesn't write the Tanoim, which would be the authors of the Mishnah, and doesn't say the Amoraim, which would be the authors of the Gemara. He says early sages, because it certainly is early stages. When exactly? I don't know.
So in the whole Tractate Bracha, there's no...
Not to the best of my knowledge. Okay, so the early sages established to make Kiddush over wine in synagogue on Friday night. For what purpose? In order to fulfill the obligation of the guests who don't have wine. So we're going with Shmuel's view that the reason why we're making Kiddush and Shul is for the guests specifically, which means locals listening to the Kiddush and Shul do not fulfill their obligation for Kiddush, which means when you get home, you got to make Kiddush again. Because the Kiddush you heard in Shul was not for you.
Eating there.
Oh, because these guests are staying in rooms that are adjacent to the Shul. As I said yesterday, today shuls are shuls, but basic knesses literally means house of gathering. They look more like community centers, these synagogues. They had hospitality suites. The rabbi's office was there. The rabbinical court was there. Sometimes even the cheder where they taught kids where it was in there. It was all one big building. So there's rooms adjacent to the shul. That's where they're eating. And they're eating right there after this kiddush. And therefore this kiddush that they are hearing from the chazan and shul, for them is a kiddush that's taking place in the place where they eat. It's exactly the same thing as the rabbi on Shabbos day, which makes kiddush in the shul. The door is open to the kiddush room, and we eat right there in the kiddush room.
As long as it's in the same building.
And adjacent. Adjacent. Rooms that are adjacent, that are next to the synagogue, which is why the rabbi opens the door, and the rabbi eats a little bit of bread, a little bit of something by this place where he makes kiddush. And that way everybody can go and eat in the kiddush hall from the kiddush you just heard in the location that they are eating. So Friday night, guests out of town are doing the same thing. They're staying in rooms adjacent to the synagogue. They're eating in these rooms. So this kiddush is considered in their place of eating, and therefore the kiddush is for them.
I think presumably too in that era, you were not allowed to eat in the
That's
sanctuary.
correct. Taisus mentioned that. You're not allowed to eat in the actual sanctuary. So these are rooms adjacent to the sanctuary. Unless there was a condition, which all shows today are made by condition. But yes, Taisus mentions that. That's right. Okay, Shibashah. So now the continues. And this is something that we actually, the rabbi doesn't do, but he doesn't have to because again, the door's open and he eats, but that's a different story. Leave it alone, which is like this. At the time when the chazan would be making this kiddush in shul, the guests were already in their room. So let's use downstairs as an example. All the guests are in the social hall. Right? And they hear the kiddush from the chazan and shul. So they're literally at the place where they're going to eat. And the reason why they have to do this and the rabbi does not, because the rabbi actually eats in his place where he made kiddush. Whereas in this scenario, the guy who's making kiddush isn't eating at all. In fact, the guy making kiddush didn't even fulfill his obligation with his own kiddush. He's going to go home and make another kiddush at home. He only did it for them. So they have to be sitting in the place they're going to eat, and they hear the kiddush from there. Okay? But the rest of the community who are locals, they don't fulfill their obligation by that kiddush. Even if they had in mind, I want to fulfill my obligation from the chazan's kiddush and shul, still didn't fulfill their obligation. Why? Because they aren't listening to the kiddush in the place where they're going to eat. And the obligation is to make, this is the ruling, like Shmuel, that you have to make kiddush in the place where you're going to eat. And therefore only the guests who are in their rooms where they're going to eat and listening to kiddush from the chazan, they fulfill their obligation. Fair? This is from the Gemara so far, following the opinion of Shmuel, along with Tosfos, Rosh, and some others who give this whole idea that the guys are adjacent and they're in the room next door, even though the Gemara doesn't say so explicitly, but this is the way the Alter Rebbe brings it from all the sources. Okay, halacha beis, halacha number 2, so on the second page now.
Nobody disagrees with it.
The Alter Rebbe, I'm sure there are. There's a bunch of footnotes there, you can look them up. Okay. V'af achshav, so too today, she'ein lanu oichim ha'shoysim eitzel beis haknesses. We do not have guests who are staying in hospitality suites at the synagogue. And therefore they aren't present, that we should be making kiddush in order for them to fulfill their obligation. So maybe we should abolish it. Says the Alter Rebbe, no, afal nonetheless. It is still practice that kiddush is made over wine and shul. Why? Something that our sages established as a practice, loy batla, is not dissolved, even though the reason for why it was established was absolved. So it was established in order to help the guests that they don't need to buy wine and fulfill their obligation for making kiddush. That reason is no longer, because nowadays guests stay in hotels and the local community invites them to their home. And yet the practice should still continue.
And it's not bracha levatala.
Nope. Now, Alter Rebbe brings a proof. Kamoi, for example, bracha, but this is actually the Ramah. This is from the Ramah, which is the Ashkenazic ruling. But Beis Yosef Karo, the Sephardic ruling, actually rules not to do this because it's a bracha vatala. It's a wasted bracha. There's no one there to fulfill their obligation. Don't do it. That's right. So that this is a general, consistent difference between the Beis Yosef, the Sephardic, and the Ramah, the Ashkenazic. That the Sephardic try to minimize as much, Beis Yosef tries to minimize as much as possible to making the brachas. And usually, the Alter Rebbe follows with the Beis Yosef to minimize in brachas. And in this case, the Chabad custom is not to make Kiddush and Shul Friday night, right? None of you have ever seen it here in MTC, right? And yet, as we're going to learn, the Alter Rebbe sides with the practice of making Kiddush Friday night and Shul. So it's kind of ironic that as a practice, Chabad doesn't do it. And it's not like the practice doesn't happen because it was forgotten. In the Rebbe Shul, it didn't happen. Right? The Rebbe davened every Friday night in Shul and never instructed that they should be making Kiddush there. And so did his predecessor, the Svalman, and so on and so forth. So we can imagine that even Alter Rebbe himself and his Shul didn't do it. Now, how does that work? Just to explain briefly, the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch was written as a collection of the halachic rulings that preceded him and was meant for the wider public. So a lot of times, the rulings in the Shulchan Aruch, based on the collection of rulings from before him, don't necessarily reflect his own personal view. In fact, later he wrote a siddur with instructions in the siddur of how to practice, and sometimes the siddur is different than the Shulchan Aruch, because in the siddur he writes the way he understands, whereas in the Shulchan Aruch it's a collection of generations before, meant for the wider public, not necessarily anyone that has to follow his ruling, but just a collection. Obviously, within the connection, there's obviously his own personal insight, the way he collects, the way he formulates the collection, and so on. But nonetheless, primarily it's a collection.
Doesn't it come down at the end of his opinion?
Not always in the Shulchan, not always. Sometimes he rules his opinion based on the collection, correct?
Like Rambam.
Heavily reliant on the Magen Avraham for the most part, actually, which is one of the earlier commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. But in the Siddur, which is a later work that the Alter Rebbe wrote, like a Siddur with instructions, sometimes there he does give straight his opinion, obviously based on earlier sources, but his thinking, relying less on the previous generations, meaning the generations just preceded him, but relying on much earlier generations like the Rishonim, and sometimes there is different in the Shulchan Aruch. Now, in the Siddur, it's not mentioned. The Siddur does not mention here make Kiddush and Shul. Maybe that's why the practice fell away in Chabad. But nonetheless, in the Shulchan Aruch, as we're going to see, he's going to side with those who say to actually make Kiddush and Shul, as is the Ashkenazic custom, as per the Ramah. Clear? Okay.
So he was giving deference to that.
In the Shulchan Aruch, yes. In the Shulchan Aruch, he gives deference to the prevailing Ashkenazic custom. That's correct. Following Ramah, and then following the Ramah being a gloss on the Shulchan Aruch, which is relatively the same generation as Shulchan Aruch, actually the exact same time as Yosef Karo, and then the commentaries in the Shulchan Aruch, which come later, the Shach, the Taz, the Magen Avraham, the Alter Rebbe relies primarily on the Magen Avraham.
Everybody personally have to do it.
No. The Chazan makes Kiddush and Shul for everyone, or for the guests, and everybody says Amen. Now, today there are no guests, but nonetheless, we're out there telling us, based on Ramah, still keep the practice, because when the sages instituted a practice, even if the reason for why they instituted that is no longer, still keep the practice. So the reason for the practice, which is the guests, are no longer because there are no guests eating in Shul anymore, but still keep the practice because the sages established it, just keep it going. But it's a question of a bracha. It's not a question of how much time. It's a question of saying Hashem's name of the bracha. But the Ramah and the Alter Rebbe is going with this. It seems to imply that the fact that the sages said to do it is good enough of a reason to do it, even though, right? Which lends gravity to this idea that when the sages instituted something, it's by divine inspiration. So even though they gave a specific reason for why they established it, and that reason is gone, but the divine inspiration that comes along with that establishment doesn't disappear just because the reason is gone. And therefore stick to the practice even though the reason for why they established it is gone. Because clearly there's some divine inspiration.
We could think of a lot of other blessings, let's say, that we do even if it doesn't
have reasons.
No, but even if it doesn't like apply today, or
there are many cases like that. Now let me give one example from Shabbos. For example, bracha me'en zayin, the blessing that is similar to the seven. What he's talking about is we don't do repetition of Amidah on Friday at evening service at Ma'ariv. Right? We repeat the service at Shachris, we repeat the service at Mincha, but not at Ma'ariv. Now, on Friday night, we do a hybrid. We don't actually repeat the Amidah, but the Chazan says a bracha that is like a condensed version of all the brachas of Shemona Esrei. The brachas of Shemona Esrei on Friday night have 7 brachas. the 3 opening ones, Telak El Kadosh, the 3 at the end from Moedim, and one in the middle about Shabbos at 7. So the Chazan doesn't repeat himself, but he sings, right? We sing Magen Avraham, and we sing after Vayachulu, we sing, you know what's the bracha the Chazan makes? That whole bracha is like a condensed version of the bracha Shemona Esrei. So it's not a repetition of the Amidah, but it's a miniature repetition, kind of. Sorry, it's called the condensed 7, Me'ain 7, Me'ain Zion. Now, why do we do it nowadays? Why was it this established? Because in the old days, shuls were not in the center of town. Shuls were actually out of town. You have a little village, a couple hundred people, and the shul wasn't in the center of town. The shul was actually outside.
They wanted them to leave early.
People would go to shul, or they would go learn. It was a way of staying away from distraction. Because again, the shul was the community center where everything happened there. The courts took place from there, the school was there, everything was there. So it was kind of out of town, and that way it was away from the distractions of the city, of the market, or whatever. Right? So Friday nights, people might come late to shul, and if they come late to shul and they daven, and by the time they're finished davening, the community is already done, the minyan's done, and the minyan goes home, they're left alone in shul. It's dangerous to walk home at night in the dark, from out of town. So therefore, they extended the service a little bit by adding this extra bracha, so that people who are late won't be left alone after the service is over. That's the reason. Now, we still do this practice of that extra bracha after davening, even nowadays, where our synagogues and B'yishuv are in the cities. Here in Hampstead, there's no issue with someone coming late and going home at home late at night. It's around the block, there's lights in the street, there's no danger. But yet we still make that bracha. So here you see another example on Shabbos, where once the sages establish a certain bracha, that bracha stays, even though the reason for why it was established is no longer. So same thing here. Even though the reason why Kiddush and Shul Friday night was established was so that guests who are in town and eating in Shul can fulfill their obligation, and that is no longer because we have no guests eating in Shul Friday night on a weekly basis. Nonetheless, the practice of making the bracha, making the Kiddush and Shul, should continue, says Alter Rebbe. Yeah, clear? Alter Rebbe continues. Even though there are those who disagree and they object to this practice, to make Kiddush and Shul nowadays, we have no guests. And indeed, there are many places which have adopted this practice. Many countries, in the Sephardic countries, not to make the Kiddush and Shul. So there are those who disagree, Beis Yosef, and many countries have adopted the Beis Yosef's view not to make Kiddush and Shul Friday night because it's an extra bracha for no reason, because no guests. And many countries follow that, all the North African countries, all the Sephardic countries, including Eretz Yisrael. In those days, nonetheless, the Medinas Elu, these countries in Ashkenazic lands, the Alter Rebbe is in White Russia, in the Ashkenazic countries, Shenogu boy, the Medinas Elu Shenogu boy, in these countries where the practice is to make Kiddush, ein levat laminig, we should not abolish the custom, even though the reason is gone. Why? Because the first opinion, which says that when the sages establish a practice, even if the reason is gone, the practice still stays, that's the primary way of thinking. And therefore, in our countries where the custom is not to make Kiddush, to make Kiddush, make Kiddush. In countries where the custom is not to make Kiddush, in Sephardic countries, I'm not suggesting that they start adopting that practice. Because they already established not to make Kiddush, okay, don't make Kiddush. But our countries, I'm not making a motion to abolish the practice. Because on the contrary, the primary view, the correct view, says the Alter Rebbe, is to think that when the sages established the practice, even if the reason is gone, keep the practice going. From these words, it seems like the Alter Rebbe sides with saying to make Kiddush and Shul on Friday night. And yet, as I mentioned, in the Chabad custom, it's not the practice. Okay.
Couldn't it be simply fulfilled by by the person making the Kiddush eat something
In Shul.
And drink oil. They sometimes have children drink.
Okay, we're going to get to that in a second.
Right, I know.
We'll get to that in a second. We'll get to that in a moment. The very next halachas will discuss that. Yeah, we're going to discuss that in a second.
Maybe it's for, again, not for him because he, I guess, knows what he's doing, but for the greater public, the more you abolish things, and then you don't have to do it at synagogue. They're not going to do it at home either.
That could be.
Rabbi,
That could be.
Rabbi, agree with that?
There was 770 never had Kiddush Friday night initial. Never SHUL, they never made Kiddush Friday night initial. So that's the Chabad custom officially, because they never didn't do it.
30,000 people.
Yeah, and I presume if they ever didn't do it, I'm assuming his father and father-in-law did not do it either, and neither did going back generations, they didn't do it. Right? What happened in the Alter Rebbe SHUL, I don't know. Okay, the Alter Rebbe goes even further. The Yesh Megadol Hadar, there are some of the great people of our generation, Shoyanoyeg, or generations past, Shoyanoyeg Liknes Mahakol, they would purchase from the community mitzvah sayayin shel kiddush zeh, the mitzvah of the wine of this kiddush. Not only was it not abolished, but they actually turned it into an honor. The honor of sponsoring that kiddush. And they would pay much more than it cost for the wine. It was like a fundraiser. Who gets the honor of the kiddush Friday night, even though no one's fulfilling their obligation with this kiddush? Right? They wanted these great people wanted to pay for it themselves. No one else should pay for it. They wanted the honor of that sponsoring that kiddush. And indeed, this is the practice now. The mixes medinos in a number of countries, to pay with a lot of money to sponsor that kiddush. Now you'll notice on Shabbos day in SHUL, they make a bracha after Kriyas Torah. They make a bracha. They make a misha berach for the community, and those who give wine and kiddush, wine for kiddush and Havdalah, and those who give food for the wayfarers. The wine and kiddush for Havdalah referred to here is the kiddush Friday night in SHUL. That's right. It's talking about this kiddush, which we didn't even do. But the wine and kiddush that they're talking about is this one. It's the people who sponsored the wine for the kiddush and the Havdalah. So the Havdalah is easier because we'll fulfill their obligation with Havdalah. But the kiddush, no one's fulfilling their obligation, and yet there were people who would sponsor it. It says, "Ve'ein levat laminig," do not abolish this custom. Because there are many great sages from the post-Mishnah Talmudic era which established this idea of sponsoring the Kiddush Friday night as a great source of blessing to sponsor that. And they pay much more than the wine was worth. It was like a fundraiser. Who gets the honor of this Kiddush? Which we don't do. And which even when they did do, no one was fulfilling their obligation. And yet because the sages established it, it stayed and became an honor. Quite remarkable. Okay, 2 more halachas. Next page, the third halacha. To your point. Hamekadesh bebeis hakneses, one who makes kiddush in SHUL. The one who makes kiddush in SHUL, the chazan. Aser loy litim hakois. He may not drink from the cup of wine. Why? Because he's not fulfilling his obligation in this kiddush. Nobody is. Even the guy making kiddush isn't fulfilling his obligation. He's only doing it to maintain the sage's establishment, maintain the sage's enactment. And if we cannot drink from the wine, because one may not taste anything without before kiddush. So even though he just made kiddush, he's actually still before kiddush. So he can't even drink from the wine that he just made a bracha on. So isn't that a wasted bracha? He just made bracha hagafen, and now he's not drinking it. What does he do? Elokei said Yasa. So what should he do? What should he do so that his blessing over the wine hagafen should not be levatola for waste? What should he do? So it says he should give from the cup to a minor to drink, but the minor should be old enough that he came to the age of education. Meaning, if you give it to a 2-3-year-old who doesn't understand what's going on, it doesn't count as a bracha. But if you give it to a child who's already 7, 8, certainly 9 years old, I think that's the threshold, is 9, unless he's smart enough. It starts at 7, if I'm not mistaken. He's considered a child who's reached the age of education. He appreciates what a bracha is, right? So him, you can give him something to drink from the wine, right? The minor, the child, will listen to the bracha, and the child fulfills his obligation for a bracha by saying amen to the adult. And therefore the result is it wasn't a wasted bracha because the chazan made a bracha for the child's hagafen. Because you're allowed to give the child to eat something before kiddush, whether kiddush by day or by night. This is an important fact, which is you're not allowed to give something to a child that's forbidden. You're not allowed to feed a child not kosher. So if Torah says you're not allowed to eat before kiddush, how can I get to the child to eat before kiddush? Says that you're allowed to. Why? You're not allowed to torture a child. So why is this relevant? You may not feed a child something which is forbidden, lit by hand, only if the food itself is not kosher. So you can't serve him milk and meat. Could go in treifa, like non-kosher food, if you like. But if the food itself is kosher, but now it's a time when you're not allowed to eat it. For example, on Yom Kippur, the food itself is kosher, but now is a time when you're not allowed to eat it. So you're allowed to give a child to eat that. So you can't give a child mixed milk and meat, but you could give a child food in Yom Kippur, because the food itself isn't not kosher. It's the time that holds him back. You can feed a child in Yom Kippur. Even a child who nothing's going to happen to him if he fasts. You're still allowed to feed him breakfast on Yom Kippur morning, as long as the food itself is kosher. So too here, even though it's a time when you're not allowed to eat, but the wine is kosher, so you can give him something to drink. And therefore, in order for the hagafa not to be a waste, and this is indeed a practice in Ashkenazi shuls, if you've ever been, the chazan makes kiddush and he has a child next to him. It's like an honor. They give one of the kids a stand next to him. The chazan says hagafen, says having in mind the child to drink, and then gives to the child. The child does not make hagafen. He says amen to the adult's bracha, and the amen he said, that's his own bracha. And therefore the bracha that the adult made was for the child. Hagafen. Okay, clear? Okay. The im ein cotton basic necessary. I want to finish this very, very short. We have a little bit left. Then ein cotton basic necessary. If there is no minor in the shul, so what does he do now? He's stuck. You can't make hagafen wasted. You can't not drink wine after hagafen. Right? So what does he do? Yitim makadesh atzmai. The guy himself who made kiddush, the chazan, he'll drink something. Or the macher, or someone else in shul. And he should drink enough that will make him obligated to make an after bracha. The hainu revius, which is the measure called the revius, about 3.5 ounces. Why? Why does he have to drink that much? Because once the chazan drinks from the wine, what's he saying? That these brachas were for me. Right? If the minor drinks the wine, so he's not making the brachas for himself, he's making it for everybody else. But once he's drinking the wine himself, that means the brachas are for him. If the brachas are for him, that means he fulfills his obligation for kiddush. And if he fulfills his obligation for kiddush, he must eat a meal in the place of his kiddush. And therefore, he has to drink at least a revius of wine. Why? Because there is a view. There is a view which says the drinking of wine itself constitutes the meal in the presence of which you're making kiddush. Right? You have to make kiddush in the place where you're eating. So because he's fulfilling his obligation with kiddush now, because there's no child to drink the wine, so now if this is his kiddush, he also has to have a meal here. The minimum for a meal, at least according to one opinion, is that he drinks a revius of wine, and therefore he has to drink that as well. At least drink that. Therefore, you should have in mind to fulfill his obligation for kiddush. Because if he doesn't fulfill his obligation for kiddush in this bracha, kiddush, he can't drink the wine because he's not allowed to drink before kiddush. So the only way for him to make hagafen is if someone drinks. And if he's the one drinking, he has to have kiddush first because you're not allowed to eat unless you can make kiddush first. Now, if you're making kiddush and you're going to drink, you have to drink enough that it constitutes a meal in the place of your kiddush. Following? Now, that means when he gets home, he's allowed to make kiddush. He already fulfilled his obligation.
If it's a new meal and his family's there.
You can't make kiddush again for a new meal. Oh, yeah. Nonetheless, he's allowed to go home and make kiddush again, not for himself. In order for his wife, his children, and members of his household, that they should fulfill the obligation of kiddush. If they don't know how to make kiddush themselves, but if they know how to make kiddush themselves, they have to, because he already fulfilled his obligation in kiddush. Okay. In conclusion, last halacha, it's the custom to stand while the chazan is making this kiddush in shul, even though no one's fulfilling their obligation, not even the guy making the kiddush, if he's giving it to a child to drink. If he's drinking himself, and he's fulfilling his obligation, he must drink something, and if he's drinking something, he has to fulfill his obligation, and if he has to drink enough to fulfill his obligation to eat kiddush in the place where he's eating. But if there's another child there, no one's fulfilling their obligation, just the child is drinking from the wine. But nonetheless, the custom is to stand. And early sages tell us Shezeh moil la'yefes harekayim. And standing while the chazan and shul is making Kiddush Friday night is a special blessing for tired knees, to help a person with stronger knees. So not only is there, it's so funny that this custom is abolished. The reason for the custom is abolished. There's no guest in shul. The practice still continues. Not only it still continues, sponsoring it is a great honor, and not only sponsoring a great honor, but standing while it's happening is a blessing for stronger knees. And after all of that, Chabad still doesn't do it. So it's one of these mysteries.
And we don't know reason.
And I can't tell you why Chabad doesn't do it. That's something I told you when I learned this the first time. I was like, why aren't we doing this? I mean, the Rebbe didn't do it in the shul, so clearly it's not the Chabad custom. But nonetheless, the way the Alter was writing about it seems like such an important, special thing. But nonetheless,
Unless he was concerned
with a wasted.
or not do it correctly.
Right, but we have no source. We have no source about the rights. Don't do it because I'm worried about X.
Oh, yeah, no.
We don't have a source like that.
Just the theory.
So we can like reverse engineer as to why Chabad doesn't do it, but this is the.
Right.
I encourage you to take the copies here and read the footnotes because the English footnotes have a lot of interesting other details. And God willing, tomorrow we'll get back to the Gemara, where the Gemara discusses in great detail the laws around making Kiddush in the place where you eat. When we're done that, we'll go to the Shulchan Aruch again, section 273, where it discusses the laws of making Kiddush in the place where you eat. Some of the questions you talked about, same room, same house, different room, that kind of thing. And then we'll get back to the laws of Kiddush itself, which will take us another 4 or 5 pages. And then from there, we'll go to section 271, in out the Shulchan Aruch, to discuss the laws of Kiddush, especially the laws of covering the bread while you're making Kiddush, if you're in the middle of a meal, that whole business. And then we'll get back to the halachas of not eating before the Seder night. This is the trajectory of the next 8 or 9 pages. Yeah. Have a wonderful day, Eden.